So much can happen between now and 2050. But the decisions we make today will shape the quality of our future and determine the long-term sustainability of the planet. It's time to change the way we think, adapt to new challenges, and create innovative solutions to meet the needs of a changing world. And the solutions are out there. By working together, we will find them. And together, we will build a better future that we can all share.
Ladies and gentlemen, your moderator for today's forum, journalist and broadcaster, Mrs. Drillon.
Hello everyone. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Now let me get this mic. It's a great honor for me to be here with you. I'm Ces Orenia Drillon. I hope you guys are all fueled up because we have a great day of discussion ahead. Welcome everybody to Shell Powering Progress Together, a forum on energy, water, and food. Together, you and I will be listening to speakers who have come from across the globe. And in the Philippines, they're experts in their field. We will be listening to their insights on the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead as we address the energy, water, food nexus. We will first start with a global perspective, sharpening our focus to the Asian experience and getting an up-close look at the Philippine situation. You will also be listening to inspiring stories from people who have found solutions to such daunting problems. So we'd like all of you to be part of the discussion. Please, unlike other conferences where you're asked to turn off your cell phones, we'd like you to make use of those cell phones because we have such a thing that is called Pigeonhole Live, where you will be encouraged to participate. The discussion will not just be on stage, but also with you. So I'll tell you more about Pigeonhole later on in the program. We will also want you to ask questions via that Pigeonhole Live, and I'll explain the details later. I'm sure you've noticed all the cameras around us. That's because we'll be beaming our discussion live to the rest of the world, no matter what time zone there is. So we'd like you to also check the live stream on Rappler.com. But there will be a discussion here as well, and we'd like you to share your viewpoints from here. And I'm sure, how many of you are on social media? How many of you tweet? Oh, wow, sir. Great, that's good, because we'd like to share with you that the hashtag for this event is Shell Powering Progress. So every time you send out a tweet about an interesting point that you'd like to share with your friends, do use that hashtag. And so now let's get down to business, everybody. To give you a proper welcome, I'd like to invite Mr. Simon Henry, the Chief Financial Officer of Royal Dutch Shell, to officially kick off our forum. Simon?
Ces, thank you very much. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much this morning for joining us here in Manila. Mabuhay. And thank you for fighting your way through the Manila traffic, which I know we've added a little to this week. And that is part of the discussion today, of course. 27 years ago, the late Corazon Aquino visited the Manila Hotel as president. And she was addressing an audience of senior business leaders, and probably representatives of Shell were here. And in her remarks, she tackled complaints about the state of the economy, about law and order and the political process, but she ended her speech with the words, "Together, our future can be as bright as we choose to make it." Now, I've been visiting the Philippines now for 17 years. I've been here many times, and things have certainly changed for the better in that time. Despite the many challenges that life has thrown at the country, including natural challenges, natural disasters, this country is thriving. But it's in that spirit of working together, championed by Mrs. Aquino, that I'm pleased to welcome you all here today on behalf of Shell. Now, as part of my job, I am lucky enough to attend many events like this one and to see how people outside Shell and in partnership with us are helping to make our collective future bright. At Shell, we're particularly proud of the partnership we've built over the years with the people of the Philippines. This year, 2014, is the 100th anniversary of Shell's activities in the Philippines. And back then, thank you very much. And back then, we used to deliver, I think, a kerosene on the back of buffaloes to our customers. We had 6 people working in Manila. Today, we have 4,000 staff employees here in the Philippines, and it's one of our fastest growing employee bases in the world. And we're delighted to have been able to contribute to the welfare of this dynamic country through organizations such as the Philippines Business for Social Progress Group and the Pilipinas Shell Foundation. And we're delighted that through our over 1,000 retail outlets and the huge Malampaya deep water gas project that we're actually helping to power the economic growth that we see around us. So what's the purpose of this event, Powering Progress Together? Well, at Shell, we take a deep interest in long-term scenario planning. In fact, our head of planning is here to speak later, Jeremy Bentham. And as an energy business, we make investments that last for 10, 20, even 40 years. And that's why we take such an interest. We just don't have a choice. So it won't surprise you to hear that we see quite some challenges ahead. Population's rising fast, you see that in the film. 7 billion today, 9 billion by the middle of this century. And as population numbers rise, so do the aspirations of people. In Asia, the GDP continues to grow at 6% per annum. And in that period to 2050, maybe another 3 billion people will join the ranks of the consuming middle class. So naturally, we all celebrate that economic growth. It is a good thing, but it does bring a unique set of challenges. And that growing global middle class means that people are looking for a better quality of life, including greater access to goods, services, and energy. And that is increasing pressure on our natural resources. And here in Southeast Asia alone, energy demand in the last 24 years has grown by a factor of 2.5 times. Now, if that wasn't daunting enough, we have to meet that growing energy demand as well as dealing with a range of other resource stresses and environmental challenges. Now, we in Shell, we thought long and hard about how best to respond to this challenge, and we fully agree with those who would argue that there's a fundamental relationship between energy, water, and food, sometimes called the stress nexus. Now, put simply, we need water to extract energy and generate power. That energy is needed to treat and transport power, treat and transport water, and both energy and water are needed to grow and process food. And it's that population growth plus increasing urbanization that has basically doubled. The urban population has doubled in Asia in the last 20 years, and that means the pressure on those resources, it just continues to build, and you see some statistics outside. So the intention of this event is to help develop a greater, more effective response to that pressure. So we look to bring together today, but also in similar events around the world, leading thinkers and actors on these issues. Many of you with specific regional expertise. You understand Asia. We hope both to heighten the understanding of the challenges and to help apply that understanding in some real-world action. So we have our own clear ideas about what needs to be done. A greater role for cleaner burning gas, improved water and energy efficiency, an expanded science-based interdisciplinary research effort, better integrated cross-border government policy making, innovative cross-sector partnerships, energy, food, and other sectors, and last but not least, better urban planning and development, back to the traffic. But we know we don't have all the answers, which is where you all come in. Because gatherings like this, they're an open forum for ideas sharing and partnership building. They're a crucial step to the kind of proactive, informed, collaborative solution that we all need in search for that brighter future. So thank you in advance for your efforts, your contributions, and thank you for your attention. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Simon, for giving us food for thought for the next day. We hope that the dialogues and debates that follow today will spark some innovative responses that lead to solutions that particularly to the challenges that Simon mentioned. As I've said earlier, remember I talked about Pigeonhole Live. Now we'll show you what exactly this is all about and how you can participate. So for those of you who have smartphones, tablets, and laptops, connect to the networks PPT 1, 2, or 3. Go to phlive.at. Don't worry about the HTTP or the www. Enter password PPT Manila, that's PPT MANILA. Click Go, and you're now free to fire away those burning questions you've always wanted to ask, particularly on the challenges faced by the energy, water, and food nexus. And you'll notice as you go to your screen that unless yours is the very first question submitted, you will see a list of questions at the bottom half of the screen. Scroll down, you can scroll down and you'll see if you see that your question has already been asked, or if you think one of the questions that you see there is of particular interest, vote for it. Tap the vote button on the left-hand side. Questions with the most votes will be put to the panel. Questions are anonymous, ladies and gentlemen, so don't be shy. Also, we haven't forgotten those of you who may not be using smartphones, who may have left their tablets or laptops at home or in their rooms. So you can text your questions as well to this number, plus 63917 698 1199. You can see it on your screen. Let me go through that again. Plus 63917 698 1199. You can ask questions and also share your viewpoints and comments. All right? Now, back to business. All this mention of the energy, water, food, stress nexus, what exactly is this? How are we responding to the connection between the energy, water, and food resources in the globe? How do we readjust our current mode of thinking and problem solving to overcome the new challenges? And to start off this discussion, we have the Vice President, Global Business Environment of Royal Dutch Shell, Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Tess. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be in a warm and sunny place. As you can imagine, I've come from Northern Europe. It's a real pleasure to be sharing with you, I hope, something of the way that we think about these matters and why we think about them. Simon has already said, we think over the implications of choices for the long term because we're in an industry which is developing infrastructure that has an impact over the long term. And so we look at the future and the pressures that are shaping the future in order to make better decisions today. And I know that everybody here is influential and is making important decisions that affect not only their companies, but the outlook for their children and their grandchildren, like us. And so I hope you'll join me on this journey as we just begin to explore some of the factors that we've been considering in our long-term scenarios. Now you can see, I put up a warning that there are uncertainties ahead, and people deal with uncertainties in different ways. We're often thought of as a company of engineers and accountants, But there are lawyers as well. And sometimes lawyers think that the world can be dealt with in this way. And so I have to ask you a favor and a question. In order for me to proceed, you have to read this and click I accept. Can I assume that that means you accept? Okay, great. I'll go on. Looking to the future isn't about crystal ball gazing. It's about understanding the way that predetermined trends interact with critical uncertainties, often the choices that people make that may lead to alternative types of future, and hence building your choices to be resilient to that. We call that developing scenarios. Another way of thinking about it is creating memories of the future. That sounds strange, doesn't it? Memories of the future. But the truth is, we can't recognize developments as they're occurring unless we've seen them before. Recognize, re-understand. So this work helps us understand so that we can not only make choices now, but we can make better choices in the years ahead. And so we've developed what we call new lens scenarios to explore that. And if you're interested and you have a tablet, you can go and download an app. Just search for it in the store, the iTunes store, on Shell Scenarios. But I'm going to focus on some particular elements now. These are the kinds of forces that we see that are shaping the world and are shaping our thinking. I'm sure you'll recognize them. We see that the business cycle is going to be more intense in the years ahead compared to that period that Ben Bernanke, the ex-Fed chairman in the US, referred to as the Great Moderation. And that adds to already stresses in the political and social sphere because it means there are more periods when there are winners and losers. We see the multilateral institutions struggling because they are governed effectively in the same way as they were governed post the Second World War, and yet they're having difficulty accommodating the rising economic powers. Demographics have already been mentioned, growing population, but also urbanization as prosperity increases. And the greatest social phenomenon of our time, effectively, in the world, one new Metro Manila every 2 months for the next 30 years. And of course, that represents progress, but also represents greater call on resources and challenged environmental boundaries. And in our own industry, we have new developments. For example, in North America, with the developments of natural gas. What I'm going to really focus on now is just some of that environmental boundaries, these stresses, and how water, energy, and food fit together. So in the next 15, 20 years, we see the underlying demand for energy, water, and food will all increase globally by 40%. And clearly, that kind of pace of development leads to challenges. But the challenges aren't to be seen as a silo. The connections are incredibly important, we've learned. So water and energy, water and food, food and energy. If you think about it, the water food seems obvious to us all. We know the importance of irrigation. And in fact, 70% of global freshwater use is in agriculture. But 20% is in industry. And in industry, the bulk of that is in energy, often in cooling for power generation. And so some of those blackouts that you saw, that were mentioned earlier, were actually due to problems with water for cooling for power generation plants. Very important connections there. In a fully industrialized economy like the United States, 40% of freshwater use is actually for cooling power generation. So these are important connections. And if we look at the connection between energy and food, I don't know whether you realize this, but in order to produce the food and distribute the food that we consume, on average, there are 5 calories of fossil energy behind every calorie of food consumed. And if you look at a high-end nourishment like beef, there are 40 calories of fossil fuel behind that. So very, very important connections. Everything is connected. And that makes thinking about these things complex. But you can begin to grapple with them if you're serious about it. And so, for example, about 3 years ago, our team pulled together a group of worldwide experts in each of water, energy, food, along with complexity experts to try and get a picture, to understand things better. And what they, first of all, came up with were 100 factors that connected food security, water security, and energy security. Now, 100 factors actually means round about 90,000 potential links between these things. 100,000 potential links. And I heard an expression that I've rarely heard amongst the scientists and engineers in Shell saying, we have existential angst about this issue. But they were able to draw this down into 100, from 100 key factors to a smaller number of key factors, and then look at the links between them. And this is just an illustration of that. And looking at these links, what began to become apparent is that some factors are more influential than others. So you can see that though big red factors in the center have greater influence because they touch more other factors, and they're involved in more loops. And the actual outcomes around the outside, the energy, water, and food security. And if you go to those two big factors, just to give you a sense, you have to take into account all of those large factors. But the two big factors there were associated with emissions and pricing of resources, and with urban development. So in the short term, the pricing of energy effectively, so that things don't get distorted by subsidies, and there is the ability for resources to be allocated effectively. And in the long term, you're talking about emissions, obviously air emissions, but obviously also the kinds of emissions that impact the climate, greenhouse gas emissions. And if we're talking about urban design, you can see the difference that choices make. Where, for example, personal energy use for transport in a developed economy like the United States is 3 times that in a developed economy like Europe or Japan, because of the way that cities have evolved. It makes a big difference whether cities become compact with good public transport, good infrastructure, or whether they sprawl and have poor public transport. So these are the kinds of factors we saw playing into these important resources. So how are we responding as a company, as an industry? Well, we have some frontline expressions. So as we're doing things, we already have a requirement that our major businesses have a water strategy. That in water-stressed areas, there are specific plans with research and development and engagement of all the local water users and the authorities. If we look at developments like biofuels, sustainable biofuels, water-fed rather than irrigation-fed, so rain-fed rather than water irrigation-fed. So in our joint venture in Brazil, Raizan, we have irrigation through just the rain, so not drawing extra water, and we develop processes that recycle 90% of the water use. So minimize the amount of water use in the development of that resource. In ground birch in Canada, We've invested in, again, water storage and treatment facilities for recycling, and also funded in the local town, Dawson Creek, water facilities that can engage with our own water use and also provide more municipal water use, for example, for playing fields and the like. If we think about knowledge, knowledge is very important in this area. And so we found that nobody had a really rigorous way of accounting for water use in industry and in the energy industry. So we worked with specialists at the University of Utrecht and with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and developed an accounting form to look at water withdrawal and water use, water consumption, water discharge, and have developed this industry standard for looking at it, and we built it into our own energy models. So we understand how, over the next decades, the use of different forms of energy will have an impact on the needs for water. So we see, for example, water use growing in terms of water withdrawal, but because new technologies can be applied for circulating water in cooling of power plants, we see that coming to a plateau and even declining. The small amount of water consumption in energy will continue to rise, and again, largely driven by things like the power sector, but also the development of biofuels globally. If we think about the way that we collaborate, that is so important because these stresses cross boundaries, national boundaries, public-private boundaries, industry sector boundaries. So, for example, we've helped create an activity amongst a handful of major international companies called the Resilience Action Initiative, which is partly developing knowledge on resilience. And Professor Walker will speak in a few moments about resilience, including some of the things that we've learnt from him and others in this field, and are applying it in, for example, the way that we're considering land degradation and the impact of that and the needs for water in developments in South Africa. And, for example, the way that we're learning that for our own water use, it's going to be probably more efficient to invest in local farm water use efficiency than shipping in water from other parts of Africa into those kinds of operations. So this is an ongoing target. We're working with non-governmental organizations such as the Nature Conservancy on the way that, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, oyster beds can be used effectively as a green infrastructure to help prevent land erosion, but also protect pipelines for energy in that area as well. So what are we learning? Because this is a journey, as you can tell, and we're all learning in this together. So I'll just highlight some of the key points that we are learning from this. First of all, it is essential to think about the longer-term impact of choices and developments and think broadly about the interactions between water, energy, food, land use, and climate. The challenges are clear, and they can be troubling. There are going to be stresses in the world, but we also see that progress is feasible. We don't just have to drift towards the worst of all worlds. We can make choices as a business, but also fundamentally social and political choices that can improve, again, that word, resilience. It requires a change of mindset. We are so conditioned in our world to have an either-or mindset. It's either do this or do that. And we lose the and. And whilst we're arguing about either or, time passes and pressures build up. So it is important to have this and mindset and to act in a timely and decisive way. From an energy point of view, this means efficiency, and it means cleaner fossil fuels, natural gas growth outstripping coal growth, particular issue in Asia, and it means the ongoing development and deployment at scale of renewable technologies. And what you hear are advocates for these in silos. And one lesson to learn is think of these things together. And to do this, we have to recognize that the success of tomorrow depends on how well the different pillars of society are able to act together. Business and government and civil society. Now you can tell from my age that, I was a child of the 70s, okay? A few of you may remember them. Do you remember disco dancing? Yeah. I am not going to demonstrate. But dancing on your own was relatively straightforward. Even dancing with somebody else was okay. But kind of orchestrated, dancing collectively together, it's difficult. But it's worth the effort. And I know that there are many festivals in this country that are dance festivals. I believe this is a photograph of the Tanalak Festival of dancing. But it can be done. But it's hard to do. And I hope that by coming together, we will find the way to dance well together. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Do take this seat. Well, I have to tell you that you've come to the right country. This is where there's a lot of dancing happening and singing. You talked about resilience in your presentation, and our next speaker has studied resilience extensively. And so do welcome our next speaker, who will be speaking about resilience in the context of food, water, energy, Dr. Brian Walker, the chair of the board, Resilience Alliance and CSIRO Australia. Brian, go ahead.
Thank you, Sis, and good morning, everybody. Jeremy's given us a really good introduction to the stress nexus, and so I would actually like to begin by looking at it. And what he clearly said was that of the three, any one of those strongly affects the other two and is strongly affected by the other two. That makes it a complex system. But that complex system is embedded in a much larger one. You have climate change, antibiotic resistance and new diseases, refugees, wars, and terrorism. These are trends that are occurring outside that system, economic shocks, and others, that question mark that I haven't put in. They all influence one or more of food, energy, and water, and food, energy, and water influences one or more of all of those. That is truly a complex system. And the thing about complex systems is that you cannot predict particular outcomes. It's not possible to say, well, what we'll do, we'll develop this strategy because that'll take care of the problem. It's just not feasible. Therefore, it's very necessary to build resilience so that we can deal with whatever happens. And the definition of resilience, the informal one that works rather well, is this one: the ability to cope with shocks and keep functioning in much the same kind of way. And that's what we mean, coping capacity. The more formal definition applies these three things. It's the ability to absorb disturbance and reorganize so that you keep the same function, structure, and feedbacks. Those feedbacks in the system are crucial. And that allows you to keep the same identity of the system. You don't become a different kind of system. But there are limits to resilience, to that self-organizing capacity. And that brings up this notion of thresholds and tipping points, which I'm sure you've all heard of. But let me just give you a bit of an example of that, because sometimes it's not all that clear. And I'll use coral reefs. The coral reefs all around the world are changing badly at the moment and under huge stress. Coral reefs can exist in one of two states. The coral one that everybody loves with healthy corals, or it can flip into what's called an algal state, where it loses all dead corals and all of the good things disappear. And there are two thresholds where that change occurs. The one is on the vertical axis there, having too much extra nutrients flowing in and around the coral reef from fertilizer from land and agriculture. And the other one is fishing pressure. If you take out all of the fish that graze on algae, above some particular point, it flips the system from coral to algae. You put too much nutrients in, which favors algae, and it flips the system there. Now note that the more nutrients you put in, the less fishing pressure you need to flip the system. And the more fishing pressure that there is, the less nutrients it takes to flip the system. So they interact. And once it's gone over, you can't come back again. You don't just come back at the same point. You have to bring it way back and keep it down with no fishing pressure, no nutrients, for a long time before you can recover, if at all. And furthermore, those thresholds are not fixed. They change with external conditions. As the sea temperature warms and as acidity rises through carbon dioxide, it is taking less fishing pressure and less nutrients to flip corals from coral to algae. So it's that changing resilience due to the external that's a problem. So that's a quick wrap-up on how thresholds work in an actual system. They can interact and they change. Now, it's not only in biophysical ones. Social systems have them. Crowd behavior, riots, fads have typical tipping points where they take off. The scary phenomenon of crowd waves. In economic systems, the debt-to-income ratio, the labor supply levels have tipping points where the system goes from being positive to negative. So we have social system thresholds as well as ecological. At the planetary scale, this is now quite a well-known diagram developed by about 20 scientists, and I was one, and we identified some 9 planetary boundaries in the Anthropocene that we now live in. These boundaries, and I'm not going to go through them all, but like climate change, the amount of nitrogen that's going into the system, the amount of phosphorus, the rate of biodiversity losses, all have limits. If we go past those limits, the Earth as a whole will not keep functioning in the same way that it has for the past 10,000 years. And what that means, we're yet trying to figure out. So the point I want to make is that thresholds occur in biological, in ecological, in social, at fine scale to regional scales, agricultural systems, countries, and the globe. And because of this, there's a danger in trying to focus on a particular known threshold. And that's because making a system resilient in one way can cause it to lose resilience in other ways. There are trade-offs in applying resilience. They're inevitable. And therefore, it's necessary to understand general resilience, the capacity to cope with all kinds of shocks in any part of the system. So what kinds of things make a system generally resilient? What attributes confer that? Well, the first obvious one is having a high diversity. Lots of different ways of doing the same thing. Having lots of species in an ecosystem, having lots of supply routes for a company or a town. That diversity makes it, and nobody disputes that. But there are many others that we're learning about and how to collectively put those in. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go through them all. But being modular and not over-connected. Fully connected systems are very vulnerable to a shock which permeates right through the system quickly. So modularity, being able to respond very quickly to change. Being open, allowing immigration and immigration into a system. Closed systems are not resilient. Having reserves, seed banks in ecosystems or memory in social systems are reserves that make the system resilient. Innovation and novelty, again and again comes up. Systems that have innovation and novelty are more resilient. Having social capital, and in particular, these three things come up in lots of studies: trust, leadership, and social networks combine to give high social capital. And the final one is adaptive and distributive governance. Having a fixed set of rules that never change, or governance system, is very non-resilient. Being able to pass decision-making down and back up again as conditions demand is very important. And I don't have time to expand them, and that list is not fixed. Resilient scholars all over the world are working on trying to get that right. But think about that, because it's really, really important. Okay, so I want to now just go on to leave you with 5 really important points about resilience. And the first one is that resilience is neither good nor bad. And it's often a mistake that people talk about resilience as if it's necessarily a good thing. There are very undesirable states of systems, some dictatorships, a saline landscape, that are very, very resilient. Sometimes you need to reduce the resilience of a system in order to change it. So resilience is a property of a system. It's not something that's necessarily good or bad. Secondly, is you cannot understand or manage the resilience of any system at one scale. This is probably the single most common mistake that I encounter in the work that I do with catchment management authorities in Australia and elsewhere in the world. People have a problem, they think about resilience, but it's a particular one, and then they focus at the scale of that problem, and they try and fix the solutions there. But it's the cross-scale connections that are so important in resilience. All systems operate at multiple scales, and not taking account of the cross-scale feedbacks and connections is what undoes so many people. And they say, oh my God, why didn't we think of that? And it's a cross-scale thing that often happens. Okay, interactions across scales are crucial. Thirdly, resilience is not about not changing. Trying to prevent disturbance and keep a system constant reduces resilience. A forest which is protected always from fire eventually loses the species in it that are capable of withstanding fire. The only way for a forest to remain and be adapted and resilient to fire is for it to be burned every now and then. Children who are protected from playing in dirt and prevented from playing in dirt with all good intentions, they grow up with compromised immune systems and develop asthma and other problems. They need to play in the dirt and be exposed to it in order for their immune systems to respond accordingly. So probing the boundaries of resilience is necessary for maintaining and building resilience. I see too often in print and ideas about preventing change as if that's creating resilience. It's not, it's eroding resilience. The fourth one is resilience includes the need for transformational change. And this is important, and I need to spend a minute on it, because if a shift has happened into a bad state or it's about to happen, and it's going to be one of these irreversible shifts, you've crossed a threshold and you can't get back again, or you're in there, or you're about to be, the only option is transformation. Adaptation is no longer there. You've got to transform. And that means the capacity to become a different kind of system. That's what transformability means. And what do I mean by a different kind of system? Well, it has different defining variables, a different identity. In many of the systems I'm working with, it's saying that this system can no longer be an irrigation farming system. It has to become some other system, a tourist one or a non-irrigation system, but it cannot be an irrigation farming system any longer for various reasons. It's got into a saline state or whatever. You have to transform and become a different system. People hate fundamental change. And so this is really hard because they go into a state of denial and they can't get past the state of denial that we actually have to transform. And my fifth point is that resilience and transformability are not opposites. Transformability and transformational change is part of resilience at multiple scales. Maintaining resilience at one scale can require transformational changes at other scales. I work with the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia, and if we want the whole basin to remain what it is, which is a highly productive system for agricultural human well-being into the long term based on water, not all parts of that system can continue doing what they're doing. For the system as a whole to be resilient, parts of it have to transform. And so this raises a question that I think each one of you in this room needs to pose in connection with the system that you're working on or are interested in. Where is there a need to build resilience because we need it and the system's good and it's good for us? And where is there a need for transformational change? It's a fundamentally important question. So to finish, resilience is really largely about learning how to change in order not to be changed by conditions and changes in the external environment. And it calls for embracing uncertainty, building systems that will be safe when they fail, rather than trying to build a fail-safe system. Because you can never predict that you're going to build a system that will be fail-safe. It won't be. Assume it will fail. How safe will it be when it fails? It's really about learning how to ride the system piggyback in that jargon. And thank you very much.
Dr. Brian, thank you so much. Please join us here. That will be your seat, although I've taken your water, so I'll just replace it in a bit. Last but not least, we have Jose Maria Lorenzo Tan, who's Chief Executive Officer of WWF Philippines. He will synthesize the presentations of these two gentlemen, of course, given the Philippines setting. Laurie, go ahead.
Thank you, Ces. Magandang umaga po. Good morning to all. We live in the Anthropocene. This is a period in which human actions play a major role in shaping the biosphere and its processes. Physical processes can no longer be examined in isolation because the human footprint has taken over as the dominant driver of change. We are a growing world. Over the next half-century, our population, as mentioned, will increase from 7 to 9 billion, swarming into megacities. Much of that growth will happen here in the Asia-Pacific. We are a diverse and highly textured world. Ultimately, however, we are really just one planet and one future. The Great Acceleration describes a sustained spike in global economic activity extending from the mid-20th century to the present. Over much of this period, we saw developing nations expending natural capital blindly, with no ecological bank statement to indicate where we were consuming resources and generating waste faster than the rate at which nature could absorb our waste and generate new resources. We plunged on. Humankind has taken our carbon footprint, built up land, forest, cropland, pastures, as well as fisheries into what is called ecological overshoot. The Global Footprint Network reports that humanity's footprint today stands at 50% beyond the planet's sustainable limits. This is the Asian century, our time. To an extent greater than ever before, Asia will define the pace and directions of global growth. The Global Footprint Network reports that Asia-Pacific's footprint now stands 77% beyond the region's sustainable limits. These trends indicate a serious ecological deficit and the clear risk of resource scarcity. This is a shared risk. These terms of reference are global. Changing consumption patterns and demographic pressures will make the risk more acute. And now, we face climate change. The demons of Pandora's box. Climate change changes everything. Characterized by interannual variability, its manifestations, though site-specific, are nonlinear, and its impacts will be systemic, redefining the world as we know it. The very real prospect of more frequent social and economic dislocation stares us all in the face. Is it the strongest species that will survive? Is it the most intelligent? Charles Darwin says no. It is the species most responsive to change. How many of us have taken the time to understand how our world will change in a climate-defined future? How many of us are taking real steps to reduce climate-induced downtime, to reconfigure our communities and capitalize on these systemic global opportunities? What good does it do to point fingers, moaning and groaning about the loss of endowments? The imperative is to understand what is here now and look for glimpses of what is coming. Then we can begin to figure out how to bounce forward rather than simply bounce back. There is no room for silo thinking, palliatives aimed at public appeasement and business-as-usual formulas. The exigencies of our climate-beleaguered future demand that we muster up the courage to walk unfamiliar paths and take the steps now to be imprecisely right rather than to remain precisely wrong. Whether in business or the public sector, this is the hallmark of leadership. To cross that bridge, there are several things we need to keep in mind. Resilience must be hardwired into strategies for both national development and business. As engines of growth, they need to work under different scenarios involving a spectrum of interacting trends. They need to proactively contribute to the resilience of crucial systems at different scales: local, national, regional, global. As shock absorbers, they need to be able to take climate shocks. They must be designed to deal with a higher frequency of spikes. They need to cushion the depth and impact of these dislocations. Without resilience, you won't be around for long. And if you're not around, how can you be sustainable? Resilience is not a cut and paste process. A climate future will play out in radically different ways in different settings. The appropriate responses of business and government, while rooted within their geographies, should involve thought and action beyond their fences. Feeding into open source, open data platforms, we have to work together. The ongoing competition to control the planet's resources is incoherent. A shared risk is not addressed by one nation or one organization seeking to control a higher share of a rapidly shrinking resource base. This merely undermines resilience. We need a new, inclusive, and equitable framework that allows the collaborative engagement of risks and opportunities by all who have a role to play. This is a tall challenge, but we have to work together. Site-specific realities will define the appropriate response. The most resilient economic systems are founded on robust infrastructure, transparent and flexible institutions, as well as functioning natural capital. The coherent and effective management of all essential ecosystem services balance us off consumption, production, and trade requirements against a country's natural resource endowments. Do the ecological math. Are we extracting more than we can afford? Are we consuming someone else's share? We court disaster if, as a planet, we continue to withdraw more than we deposit. We have to work together. Achieving coherence and resilience at one scale does not translate to achieving resilience at other levels. Resource trade-offs occur primarily at the local level. But the conceptualization and management of development objectives often occur at a national level. Climate change poses a risk to resilience at a global level. Cross-sector communications contributing to trans-scale synergy will be key. We have to work together. Development decisions made both yesterday and today will define resilience tomorrow. The greatest tension, for example, between a country's early development decisions and its later resilience lies in the stewardship of each nation's natural capital. Calcium deficiencies often lead to osteoporosis. Decisions made in the early stages of development, such as the formation of institutions and the design of infrastructure, may spawn weak resilience at later stages. We have to live with our sins. We must weave shared value chains. Excessive dependence on resource extraction can lead to permanent reductions in resilience. Emerging economies must graduate beyond that growth formula, recognizing that a commitment to sustainable use of natural systems is table stakes for the future. We must feed into and draw from collective intelligence and leapfrog past the outmoded, destructive, and polluting technologies of the past. These belong in an archive. They were not designed with resilience in mind. Sustainable development is defined as chains of shared present and future value that link source to use, supply to demand, both for today and tomorrow. We must learn how to sustainably produce more with less. We have to work together. Many questions now surround the strategy of building resilience through trade. For years, trade has been the trump card of resource-scarce economies to buy their way into resilience. By 2030, there will be 3 billion additional middle-class people in developing and emerging economies. These traditional global suppliers of natural resource will require more for domestic consumption. These nations will have the market and political power to demand first call on the resources originating within their borders. Managing trade-offs locally and nationally will become significantly more important. Old school trade formulas will no longer cut it. We have to work together. Planners need to figure out how to manage the risks of climate-related variability and disasters. Planning needs to come to grips with the changes that will happen. And while aiming for no downtime, build the platforms for new opportunity. It will be a complex and fast-changing time. In a highly urbanized world, facing a climate-defined future, the tools that cities need go way, way beyond food, water, and energy. As we talk to cities, topics such as air quality, governance, citizenship, ecosystem services, biodiversity, housing, health, mobility, accessibility, consumption, wastes, sinks, education, all come up, all feeding into mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Do we have a formula, for example, to deal with forced migration? It is estimated that by mid-century, close to 1 billion people may move to areas that are perceived to be of lower risk. To keep our cities humming, all of that must work well. Clearly, we are not talking about a tune-up. We are talking about serious retrofits. So are you a force multiplier? We have to work together. We live on a water planet. 70% of our world's surface is under the sea. For air-breathing humans, it is a hostile environment. Many years ago, I chose to enter that world. As I came to understand our oceans little by little, I discovered wonderful things that most people do not know. And each time I sit on the boat's edge to backflip into the sea, I never know what to expect. but I come prepared, with contingencies for almost all situations. Preparedness makes all the difference. When we understand what to expect and prepare for it, the most daunting of challenges morph into new worlds of possibility. A decade ago, we stumbled into the age of information. Knowledge, it was said, was the new currency. Many profound changes have happened since then. Today, we are witnessing the birth of what I call the age of citizenship, where gateways to real-time information has given access to new thinking, new formulas, new voices from new parts of our world. The archaic hierarchies of history are slowly settling into the periphery, and in their place, a global matrix of solutions and ideas is emerging. Though modular in nature, these are designed to steer us quickly toward the appropriate responses, allowing better transparency, improved cohesion, and flexibility. Unless they are designed to network, coordinate, and feedback, however, they will be nothing more than a mat of pixelated selfies. Crowdsourcing has its handicaps, I know, but so do joint ventures and roundtables. Governance is not government, it is you and I. We have to work together. There is an elephant in the room. For all this to work, there must be trust. How does one weave a synergistic global framework from dissonant ideologies, competing interests, clashing cultures, and a wide range of worldviews? The foundation for all this must be respect. Respect for each other. Respect for the cultural and natural endowments that make us what we are and keep us alive. Acknowledgement that we have different aspirations and that there is no single formula or solution. There is no level playing field. There is no silver bullet. Each nation in each region must define their own path in such a way that their key interests and interventions converge. It is not sufficient to simply connect. The task is to take this forward into an interactive weave of human action, designed collectively to fuel inclusion, build equity, and create a world equipped to rise and fall and rise again with the tides of outrageous fortune. Our journey involves transforming dissonance into harmony. Yes, we are all unique, but because we are all unique, we are really all the same. The environment is the social security system of the poor. It is also the social security system of our ever-expanding cities, where 60 to 70% of the world's population will live. We must look and act beyond our fences collectively, acknowledging that we are all connected. Boundaries must transform into bridges, locally, nationally, regionally, globally. It would serve us well to always remember that ultimately it boils down to one planet and one future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laurie. Please be kind enough to join us here. I'd like to remind everybody, Pigeonhole Live is available for you, and I've seen many now using it. So we have a top question here. It's for you, Jeremy. So tell us, Shell seems to be at the forefront in discussing these themes. How can we encourage other organizations to do this as well? I suppose if you could address how Shell really, as an organization, decided to address the Nexus.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the question. And I have to admit, I'm flattered that you think we are in the forefront of this thinking. You know, we try to be, because we try to be a responsible corporate citizen and recognize that we cannot act alone. So when we've been developing our scenarios that shape our thinking and shape our strategy, we find that the number of people involved outside Shell is twice as many as get involved inside Shell. So in the recent work that we published, there were 300 people from different parts of society around the world which contributed to that work, as well as 150 energy experts in the company. As a company, we have a long history of collaborating with others. We began as a company or two companies here in Asia, Royal Dutch and Shell Transport and Trading. And so we have a bit of DNA associated with thinking about pressures and how they form over the long term and recognizing that we work with others. Now, this fact that comes up that we have to work together is a common and key element. And it's easy to say, but it's hard to do. Because the boundaries between different institutions have developed for a good reason, the pressures of the past.
So do you see other organizations emulating what you're doing? How do you get them to do what you've started?
We do see them, and we are experimenting in different ways to pull different groups together. So I made mention of the Resilience Action Initiative, which is about 8 major international corporations at CEO level who are committed to working on practical things you can do. But it's not 8 to be exclusive, it's 8 to get the ball rolling and entrain others.
Mm-hmm. So you're, by being a model in a sense, or a pioneer, then others follow.
We believe that others will be entrained, and we do experiments across other boundaries. So for example, my team has been working with the policy wing of the Chinese State Council for the last 2 years on Chinese energy pathways. We're doing something similar in South Africa, something in India. And these are ways that you find out more about the practicalities of working together.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Now let me go to Laurie. Many people are interested in what you said earlier about this being the Asian century. So how do you see this developing?
Asia has a choice as to which way it will go. We can, because of the economic power that Asia brings to the table, we have an option here, collectively and individually, to define which way this will go, whether it will be sustainable or not. We can continue to deplete natural capital the way we have in the past, but that would be to our detriment. And it will eventually eat back.
So is it worrisome, or are you optimistic? Where are you?
We have to be hopeful. We have to be hopeful. But let's say that the patterns that are emerging, if you look at it on a country or regional basis, are spotty.
Okay, now let me go to Dr. Brian. There are several questions for you, but first, what is the cost of resilient solutions? Are poor economies able to afford this? Would you be able to put a dollar amount on resilience, on the cost of resilience?
No, that's it's a good question underlying it, but of course it's not possible to answer. And in fact, it's really one of the biggest reasons why it's not done, because I have a lot of interactions at government level. And we talk about it's very similar to climate change. It is easy to put a number on the cost of doing something about it, because you're going to put in restrictions and it's going to cost money to do this. It's easy to put in a cost of doing something. What it's not easy to do is put the cost of not doing something, because that's uncertain, brings in the uncertainties, it's in the future, and so what you do is you shelve it. And because it's easy enough for accountants to grapple with it, you've got a hard number of the cost of doing something, so therefore you don't do it, because there's nothing to put it against. Resilience is very context dependent in the same way. But I think by slowly building all of those attributes that I listed that contribute as properties that make a system generally resilient, poor countries, rich countries, poor communities can all build on that. Some of them are a bit beyond. If I can take a minute, because one of the ones I didn't put on there for time, because it hasn't yet been shown conclusively in the literature, but a very worrying one, is the rising trend of inequity and inequality. Now, I was actually severely reprimanded recently by a social scientist for using those terms interchangeably, and she pointed out that inequality is a kind of an objective measure of the uneven distribution. Inequity has a fairness connotation. Inequity is a kind of a measure of unfair inequality. And it's that erodes trust and resilience in a social capital context and is worrying a lot of social scientists. We need to get more evidence before I stick it on a list. But to me, how do poor people who are the recipients of inequity, what can they do about it? So at that scale, they can't. And that really has to be treated at a much higher scale.
Can you name a society that is resilient in a good way? Because you mentioned earlier that it's not necessarily a positive.
That's right. Oh, it's not resilient in all those different ways. Some societies are resilient in one way and not in another way. I don't think it's a legitimate question to say nominate a society that's resilient.
Not a country, a society,
I think if you look at groups of countries,
okay,
that you might say that the Nordic countries are illustrating more resilience in the sense of many of the measures that we would put on it than many other countries. And I'm just not familiar enough with the dynamics and what's happening in many of the small, poor countries. So I don't want to extend into there, but I wouldn't mind betting that many of the smaller countries are very resilient, but maybe at not as in socially high level of standing that they would like.
Why so? Because of the attributes. They have those attributes you mentioned.
Oh, no, not because of it. I think it's because of the fact that they don't have a large economy. So people's income distribution might be fair and it might be quite resilient in responding, but the standard of living may not be very high. So we can't equate being very resilient with having a generally very high standard of living. Again, it's just resilience isn't a positive or negative thing.
Now here's a question for Jeremy, which you may want to answer as well, Laurie. On collaboration, how do we make sure it works?
We've been engaging in some research about complex collaborations and what the lessons can be learned for trying to look at the ones that have worked. And this can be not only amongst the kinds of partners that we've been talking about. So we've interviewed people like General Petraeus and the different kinds of collaborations he had to lead in the tasks that he had in the world. And what we've learned is there are 5 key elements to grapple with. One is a clear people dimension. And so that means actually things like if you're going to have a collaboration, you need to have leadership championing from the very top and good people involved. There's a trust and respect dimension, that you have to be working with people with whom you have a trusting relationship. There's a dimension around managing incentives. And that's both having clear incentives for all parties, but also, at the beginning, parking the discussion about incentives for a while, recognizing that there's a big pie that you can develop together and talk later about how that gets divided up. There's a time dimension, moving from this kind of open, good discussion all the way through to pilot projects and to scaling things up. You have to think about time. And you have to think about communication and engagement. You have to have a degree of not only openness, but deliberately communicating to others what you're doing, why you're doing, and have a strategy for that, and use the feedback loops by bringing things into the media to influence the system around you.
Well, Laurie, I wanted you to comment on that because, for instance, other societies would be surprised that WWF is in a forum sponsored by Shell.
Well, the basic principle, I think what sets WWF apart, we believe in engagement. Engagement doesn't mean taking money. Engagement means relationships, what Jerry was talking about. Talking. sharing ideas. And relationships are crucial to success. There's nothing wrong with having very hard metrics, that's important to making collaborations work. But I think you have to have also a clear business case. Especially when we engage corporations, there has to be a clear business case. It cannot be driven by altruism. No, that's not sustainable. It's good to start, but it's not sustainable. Leadership, crucial. If the persons who make the decisions are not 100% committed to that, it won't happen. Because the tone at the top establishes so much.
Here's a question for Jeremy, but I think the three of you would like to address this. Now it concerns government. Governments of developing countries do not realize how big the energy and environment problem we are facing. What should Shell and other energy companies do?
I think any industrial organization you can think of as being the arms and legs of society. We get things done, but we have collectively decided as a society that the government is the brain. And the brain can't get things done without the arms and the legs, but the arms and legs can't get things done coherently without the brain. So these things do need to act together. And one of the things that we have found in many places is that there are big boundaries within government activity itself. So there are places where there isn't an energy ministry. There's a coal ministry, there's a gas ministry, there's an oil ministry. Somewhere else there's a climate ministry. These things aren't connected. And yet the issues are connected, and we see that. And so one of the things that we can do is engage with government in a way that helps government evolve to be joined up, as well as us being joined up with government.
Dr. Brian, would you like to add to that? How do we get governments to address their responsibility?
I was just trying to think of it when Jeremy was talking, and I think governments are preoccupied with the short term, and that's the biggest problem we face. Nearly all of them. Some dictatorships aren't, but that's a different problem. But most of the governments that are doing well for their people and are democratic and have a 3 or 4 year term, and they barely get into something when they've got to justify, and they dare not take the long term. And it's so frustrating to see that happen. And I think, again, some governments have a kind of a history and a practice of continuing programs despite change. And somehow that's got to come into it. How we then get the smaller developing nations of the world to engage in what I think we need is a much bigger and better discussion forum and scholarship into governance, generally, governance that influences resilience. I put that up at the last of those attributes. It comes up every time. The easy bits to deal with are the biophysical, because we can understand those. Then come all the difficult social ones. The hardest things to treat are the governance ones, the rules. There is a question that arises in many of these workshops. What are the rules, and who makes the rules for changing the rules? Because rules need to change. And how do you have that process in a governance situation? How do you get governance considered by governments? I know in my own country, there are many shortcomings in governance, and the people who are least willing to listen about that are the bureaucrats and people in the government. And so it's not just the developing countries, but I think there's a whole thing we need to do about broadening the debate about governance in the context of building resilience.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brian. I'm so sorry we've run out of time, and I have a whole list of questions here. Well, you'll be around for coffee break, right? So you can collar these gentlemen outside our ballroom. But I'd like to give you 20 seconds each as your parting shots. You know, what you'd like to leave as a mark in the minds of our audience here. And let me start with you, Jeremy, and then Dr. Brian and Laurie.
Thank you very much. If there's one thing that I'd like people to take away, it's recognizing that choices can be made that can address many of the pressures. And those choices depend on the collaboration between business and government and civil society. And you've seen us dancing together between, in this case, business and academia and non-governmental organization. We can do this, but we have to invest in it. And the action I'd like people to take away is to be serious about investing in that.
Thank you, Jerry. Dr. Brian?
I think I would repeat the question that I put up there earlier. Where do we need to build resilience because the system is favorable and good and we want it to continue? And where do we need to transform? We can no longer keep adapting to climate change. That's fiddling at the margin. It's called digging the hole deeper, and it doesn't help. Many cases require fundamental transformational change. And where do we need to do that as opposed to building resilience? And I think that's such a crucial question. I'll leave it there.
Laurie?
We have to look at climate change as an opportunity. And there's nothing wrong with posing it as the opportunity to be first to market, to be market leader, to be the organization, the corporation, the nation that will show the way. Because the world is not a level playing field, it's a slope. And everybody envies the persons at the top of that slope. Thank you.
Many thanks, gentlemen, for giving us the reality check and the solutions as well that come with it. Thank you very much. Now, it's time for a coffee break. We'd like to see you back here at 11. Please be on time because we have lots to talk about. And I do thank you for all your questions. Keep them coming. Use Pigeon Live for that, Pigeonhole Live rather, and I'll see you back here at 11. The refreshments will be served, by the way, out there in the networking zone. And you know, if your questions haven't been answered, you know who you'll ask them of, the three gentlemen here. Thank you once again.